Hello everyone and welcome to our webcast series. My name is Fadi and I thank you for watching this webcast. Today's topic is a little bit different from our typical topics for events like this. It is still within the spirit of material testing with DIC, but we're taking a practical look at a topic that's somewhat ignored, and that is the relationship between the resolution of DIC cameras and the quality of DIC measurements. So the title we picked for this webcast is In Material Testing, High Resolution Cameras Do Not Necessarily Mean Better DIC Measurements. And since this topic is big, this webcast is rather long, we broke it into two parts, as I will explain in a few moments. But first, let's just give you a brief introduction about ourselves. We are a material testing lab in Greenville, South Carolina. We perform material and component testing since about 2016. We use state-of-the-art facilities with highly skilled people performing all the tests, and we insist on coupling digital image correlation and optical metrology with almost all the tests that we perform, simply because we like to elevate the outcome of the tests that we perform, and we like to seek material insights from almost every single test that we perform, and that's why we do a lot of customization and we go beyond standard testing. The tests we cover are wide-ranging. We go from the tension test and other standard automotive tests or metal forming tests like FLC and HER. We go all the way to complex ones like shear testing, fracture testing, tension compression for spring back, and even to high-speed testing for rate sensitivity characterization. The type of outcome we usually shoot for is beyond just simple mechanical properties. We like to go and produce data that is used for development purposes, and that means obviously finite element simulations. That's why we work with customers on the level of OEMs and suppliers, tier 1, tier 2 suppliers, again for the purpose of vehicle or component development that involves usually design and finite element simulations. Last, before we go into the technical content, we are expanding in a new exciting new direction. We announced this before, or we mentioned this before, and we would like to remind you that at the end of Q2 of this year, in about a couple of months, we will be giving you more details about this exciting expansion for us. We want to break away from just doing material testing services, and we will tell you more about it again in a couple of months. So please stay tuned, watch our website, LinkedIn posts, and watch for an email from us about the specifics of this particular event in which we will announce these changes or these expansions. Now let's go to the webcast. And again, in material testing, high resolution cameras do not necessarily mean better DIC measurements. And before I go into the technical details, please remember to send us your questions and comments to support@fadiemt.com. In this particular webcast, I'm going to go straight to the motivations and objectives. Why? Because there's not really any need for any introduction. The topic is very simple, and I think most people who work in DIC understand the problem. But let me try to summarize it with these kind of motivations, the problem and the motivations for this. There seems to be a misconception about camera or image resolution in DIC and how that relates to good results in material testing. We believe that there seems to be a push for higher and higher resolution cameras as if this is the natural evolution in the field. And we fear that DIC cameras are somewhat treated like other vision applications, or DIC is treated like other vision applications where typically high resolution is better. When it comes to DIC, we feel like we perform a lot of testing, material testing with DIC. We do this on a daily basis, and we cover a large number of tests, and we cover a wide variety of test types. And from that perspective, we somewhat disagree with this general trend and general push for higher resolution cameras, because we truly believe that high resolution beyond a certain reasonable limit is not necessarily better for DIC. In fact, it's not better at all. And that's, again, within the domain of material testing that we have a lot of experience with or in. So therefore, our objectives from organizing this webcast are very simple. We would like to share our opinion about this topic, DIC camera resolution, within the domain of material testing. We're going to stay focused on material testing because that's what we know and what we work with. We would like to share with you our experience in this domain and tell you how we select and how we use DIC cameras and why we stay away from going too far in terms of resolution. And at the end of the day, it's just our opinion. We're going to mix some facts with some practical guidelines and sort of preferences that we follow. And at the end of the day, we hope that hopefully all of this content will be relevant to you and useful. The two parts I mentioned earlier, we wanted to break this webinar because it's too long, the content is too long, into two parts. In the first part, I will try to stay as technical as possible, meaning what? We're going to focus on sensors, information that we know about sensors, how they operate, and resolution, and how that sort of leads you to the selection of a camera, regardless of our opinion as AMT. And in the second part, we will try to give our perspective on the topic, and we will try to highlight that this is our opinion, or this is our practice, or this is our approach, and how we do this testing. And we're going to try to distinguish between the two. But at the end of the day, that's what I would like to do today. In the first part, focus more technical. The second part, give you more about our experience in this field. And ultimately, the objective is not to push you towards or away from any particular camera or DIC system. It's just sharing some insights with you because we've learned so many lessons over the years about what kind of sensors or cameras to use and what kind of sensors and cameras not to use. So let's get started with part one on the technical side. And we will start with DIC camera sensors, a technical overview of them, and why they're leading us to believe that high resolution is not necessarily better. And we will start with a very basic introduction about resolution, a camera sensor and image and resolution. And I wanted to simplify this in one or two slides. And in this schematic, I am providing a simple representation of how a grayscale 8-bit camera, which is the type of cameras we use for the IC, how does this kind of a camera sensor produce an image? And what does resolution mean in practical sense? Now, this is not how the sensor works, but this is how I usually present the topic of resolution to my own team when it comes to the IC and processing. So imagine you have a feature such as a glob of black paint in a sea of white, as you see here on the screen. The way I see how sensor works, you could view that as if it is a screen or a mesh of squares, as you can see here. And behind this mesh is the object. In front of it, which is outside the screen, is the sensor itself, the camera sensor. The camera sensor, all what it does is basically imposes a virtual mesh like this over whatever object that you're trying to view. And therefore, those features of the object fall now within squares, distinctive squares. These squares are actually the pixels. And if you take any particular region of interest, such as the region highlighted in red here, the sensor does not see the curves and the edges of that glob of black paint. It doesn't. What it sees is squares, and in each square, it fills it with a color. That color is a gray scale color, meaning it goes from white to black or black to white. Because it's 8-bit, you have 256 varieties of basically, or shades of this gray, and the sensor will assign one of those 256 values or gray values to that particular pixel, and that's it. So if you have a pixel that sees all white, such as the top left corner, your sensor will read 255, and if it's really black, completely black, such as the bottom right corner, the sensor will read it as 0. Interesting cases will come in where you have a pixel like this one here, you have some white and some black, and there's an edge between them. You can clearly see the edge, but again, the camera sensor doesn't see that. It will translate it into some sort of a gray because you have a, roughly speaking, a 50-50 mix or whatever. The value is maybe 100, and so on for the other pixels. And that's basically how a camera sensor works. And that's how this particular region that looks really sharp to you translates into these white and gray and black pixels, as you can see here in this table. Now, what happens when you take that camera sensor out and you replace it with a high resolution sensor? All what you're doing again is this new sensor, because it's high resolution, is applying a virtual mesh again of squares, but this mesh is technically finer. And therefore, if you try to reconsider the same zone that I considered earlier, which was highlighted in red, with this new sensor, let's say this is now blue, what you're going to end up seeing is basically a larger count of these pixels, a larger number of squares. And now you follow the same exact principle. The sensor will just look behind this mesh and take whatever information behind it and translate it into a single color, grayscale color from 0 to 56, and you ultimately end up with something like this. And now we go into the concept of resolution. This camera has more squares covering the same area, or more pixels covering the same area. So when I try to compare this camera to the previous camera, I can see now the difference. Because I'm now representing it with larger number of squares, they're finer, I can see better edge definition in the high resolution camera compared to the conventional camera. And that's basically the simple definition of resolution. So yes, if you take two cameras and you focus them on the same region of interest, a high resolution camera sensor will definitely offer you a better definition of edges and features. And that's something you can see here, and that's something you know from everyday application in your mobile phone or any other camera. So nothing has changed here. The question is, how does this relate to the quality of the IC measurement? We want to know if there is, if this higher definition of edges and features, does it really directly translate into a better DIC measurement? Well, to try to answer this question, we go to a more general question about DIC measurements. What is the required level of DIC camera resolution or spatial resolution for a DIC measurement to be a good measurement? And unfortunately, this is not an easy question to answer. And as far as I am concerned, there is no direct or simple answer to this question. It is not like other vision applications where you can see sharper is better. Here, it's a little bit more complex. And to ask the question in a different way, how does better definition of edges and features play a role here in contributing to a better DIC measurement when, as you know, in DIC, we're not really looking at big features or big edges. We're looking at a contrast, stochastic contrast pattern, as the one that you see here in my image that represents a tension test. How does a high resolution sensor play a role in improving my DIC measurement? And again, there is no direct answer because it's not a straightforward connection. But what we want to say, and this is where our personal opinion comes in, and that's why I highlighted it in orange, there are hints to give you a practical sense of what is sufficient resolution, what is reasonable, and what is beyond reasonable and somewhat excessive. And that can only come with experience and come with examples. And that's the part that I'm going to try to stay away from here and push it to the second part of this webcast. So, but for this part, I'm going to try to present whatever we know from a technical perspective. So let's examine a DIC case for a tension test. And you can see here the images at the bottom. Image 0 is the reference image, and I have some deformation happening, and I took an image X at a certain point after the sample has deformed. Now, from a DIC perspective, what do I do with this? Technically, you're supposed to take that image, especially the reference image, and mesh it, or basically divide it into specific discrete points. Those points are distributed over a grid of subsets, meaning this virtual grid that I'm showing you on the right hand side, if you take any node in this grid, it should be represented with a subset, and that subset is a group of pixels. And that group of pixels is technically arbitrary. You can set the size of that subset as you like from X to Y. There are no guidelines on what is the smallest and what is the largest subset you can use, but what matters to us right now is the following. I usually break the image into discrete points. Each point is defined by a group of pixels centered around that point. Now, if I want to take these pixels and these subsets and try to obtain strain information, that's the holy grail of DIC, between any 2 points, whether they are local, such as the 2 green points that I'm showing here, or global, much further away from each other. It doesn't matter. If I take any 2 points, DIC is all about finding these 2 green points, which are represented again by 2 subsets, and tracking them from the reference image 0 to image X. So again, what I care about is the location, the exact locations of these points, these subset centers. If I can find these subsets in the reference image and I find them exactly in the deformed image, I should be able to obtain good, reliable strain measurement. So at the end of the day, DIC is all about finding the locations of subsets within images. And this is different from better definition of edges and features. It's actually far different. And people who deal with DIC, basically the inside of DIC and how algorithms work, know that there is a huge difference between the two. You could find this particular subset in any image, and the accuracy of that finding process depends on so many parameters that go well beyond the resolution of your image. And I will list just a few of them. The subset size itself is important. If you drop the subset size below a reasonable limit, again, reasonable because there's no quantifiable number, then your algorithm will have a very hard time finding this subset. The same way, if you make the subset so large, your algorithm will have a very hard time finding it. The DIC algorithm itself, yes, these algorithms out there right now are almost similar in principle, but you might see some differences between this algorithm and that algorithm that makes this one a little bit more robust than the other. But regardless what, it's still a factor. Maybe not very big factor, not important factor as before. But the computational parameters, the subset size is one of them, of course, but there are so many other computational parameters. Just think of it like this. These DIC algorithms are, at the end of the day, iterative processes, and you need to terminate this iteration at some point. And if you terminate it too early, you end up with less accurate result, or maybe less accuracy or lower accuracy. And if you terminate it too late, you increase the accuracy or robustness of your solution, but at the end of the day, it means a higher computational time. But that's another important parameter, along with other parameters, such as lighting and the quality of your paint, the focus of your lens or camera in the first place, and so on. So at the end of the day, the bottom line is this. There is no simple, straightforward connection between camera, image resolution, and the accuracy of a DIC measurement. Camera resolution is one of many parameters, and our opinion is that beyond a certain level of resolution, it is really hard to see the impact. It is almost impossible to see it or quantify it. And that comes with experience, and we will try to show some examples of this later on today. So now, since we cannot address this particular item from a technical perspective only, let's go to some other technical items that we can sufficiently address. And that's the topic of the camera sensor itself. Camera sensors that are used for DIC typically range between 1 and 24 megapixel. These are nothing but industrial cameras. I think the general class of them is called industrial cameras, and they range between 1 and 24 megapixel. We perceive these cameras to look like this. Simplistically speaking, that when you go from 1 to 2 to 4 to whatever to 24, the sensors get larger, therefore the number of pixels is of course all larger, but they get scaled up like this. In reality, that's not really true. The case is far more complex and it looks more like this. In fact, this is a to scale representation of all the major sensors that at least we've come across in DIC and material testing. And I know it's a little bit confusing to look at them like this, so maybe to try to simplify it, I'm going to switch to colors. It helps, but maybe not too much. And that's basically the case we have. Camera sensors that are used out there, they're not necessarily square. In fact, most of them are rectangular except for a few cases. And the distribution of their pixels has nothing to do with their general label. Meaning, if someone tells you that this is a 5 or a 12 or a 9 or 20 megapixel camera, without you knowing what that sensor is, you have no idea whether it's rectangular or square just by looking at the label of the camera. Maybe you would know it by experience, because now, for example, we know the 9.1 megapixel sensor is always rectangular like this one, and the 8.1 is always square, but really you cannot tell from the label, and that's basically one of the issues. Now, why is it so complicated and why does it look so scattered? It's very simple. DIC is just one of many other applications that use industrial cameras. In fact, these cameras are technically designed not for DIC. They use them for automation, basically industrial automation and 3D scanning and so on. We as DIC, let's call it users, we borrow these cameras from these other applications and we implement them in DIC or material testing or component testing. So we just have to follow what is available on the market. Now, from our perspective, and that's why I highlighted this in orange, if we leave it to the label of the camera, it will stay confusing. From our perspective, if you deviate from that and rather look at the total, rather than looking at the total pixel count, you look at the horizontal pixel count of the sensor and look at the aspect ratio, things might get clearer. And let me try to demonstrate this in a very simple schematic. So I'm first going to throw basically to scale 1,000, 2,000, 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 pixels. And now I'm going to take those sensors that are really popular out there. The 1.2 megapixel sensor. I know some people might think that this is really too old or low resolution. We actually think it's still a decent resolution. And to give you perspective, if you're doing any high-speed testing and you're using Photon high-speed cameras, most of their cameras are still using the 1 megapixel Photon sensor, and it's a fantastic camera, or they are fantastic cameras anyway, and you will get very good information with those cameras. So the 1.2 megapixel camera sensor is not bad. But anyway, these are basically some of those, let's call them smaller sensors. When you go to a larger sensor like the 2.3 megapixel and the 4 megapixel, and even some of the 5 megapixel, this is where you hover around the 2000 pixels in the axial direction of the sensor. So these cameras give you the same sort of axial pixel count, but they differ in their aspect ratio. And now we cross the line to approach the 3000 pixels. That's where the 6 megapixel and the 8 megapixel camera come in. And then we have a big jump to the 9.1 megapixel camera. As you can see, the 9 megapixel spreads its pixels horizontally. It goes more than 4,000 pixels actually in the X direction. And along the same line comes the 12 megapixel camera, one of the most popular cameras out there and one of the ones that we don't like to use, as we will explain in part 2. And there's another camera, which is the 20 megapixel. These cameras range between 4100 and 4500 pixels in the X direction. Finally, the largest of those sensors that are spread horizontally are the 16 and the 24 megapixel cameras. And these cameras usually hit 5300 pixels in the X direction. Now, what's the point of this? You can see obviously that I colored the cameras based on the category, and the category is just based on the axial pixel count. Going from 5,000 to 1,000, I'm going from purple to blue to orange to green to gray. Because that's how we do it internally at AMT. And again, this is a classification that is really not being pushed outwards. We're not trying to impose this classification. This is how we classify these cameras, because we find that the total pixel count is meaningless for our DIC measurements, and we follow this classification. And how do we do it? We basically start with 2000 pixels, and we call this the standard resolution. Why? Because that's how DIC measurements started. The 4 megapixel and the 5 megapixel and the 2.3 megapixel cameras, these are the workhorses of DIC back in the days when we started DIC testing, and they're still fantastic cameras. And that's why we call it standard resolution. They will give you around 2000 pixels in the X direction or the axial direction, and that's technically the maximum usable number of pixels, whether you're doing a tangent test or an FLC test. It doesn't really matter. Then comes these newer cameras that offer you a little bit more, such as the 8 megapixel camera. And we call them high resolution cameras because they approach 3000 pixels in the axial direction. Then we go to the extra high resolution cameras. These are the cameras that push towards 4000 pixels, such as the 9, the 12, and the 20. And we leave ultra high resolution to anything that exceeds 4500 pixels or approaches 5000 pixels. And that would be the 24 and the 60 megapixel. Below 2000 is what we call internally as limited resolution. And that's something what we say, at least for our testing, we try to stay away from them unless we have no other option. And this is usually represented by the case of high-speed testing. Because in high-speed testing, it is not very easy and definitely not cheap to find a high resolution or even a standard resolution high-speed camera. That's almost impossible. So you have to live with a 1000 pixel count. And that's basically how we view these cameras, all of them, for the DIC applications. We typically treat them based on their axial resolution, and that tells us, roughly speaking, how to use them. And if you take this, and again, apart from the classification, these cameras are out there. If you take them and you try to use them in any application, you will see why higher pixel count, total pixel count, is very deceptive. And we're going to give you just 2 examples to prove this point. The first example is the most popular test out there, which is the axial tension test. And we grabbed 3 sensors that share the same exact pixel count in the x direction. And these are the 20, the 12, and the 9 megapixel cameras. If you were to do this test, this has nothing to do with AMT procedure. This is how anybody would do this test. If you have a tension test that you have to deal with and you want to measure, basically to record images of this test, first thing you would identify your zone of interest, which is of course the gauge area, and then you would sort of predict how much stretching this material would have, let's say 30%, great. You've identified the field of view. Now you take any one of these 3 cameras and you hone it in on that particular field of view. And if I were to impose that field of view on any one of those 3 sensors and I were to calculate the pixel resolution or the spatial resolution, they will be absolutely the same, almost exactly the same in terms of the spatial resolution. So if you try to maximize what you want to get out of any of those 3 sensors, regardless of their total pixel count, you get exactly the same result. So there is no difference whatsoever between any of these sensors when it comes to pixel coverage and spatial resolution from a DIC perspective. Now, this is of course not considering other parameters like frame rate and storage and whatsoever, but just from a technical perspective, 9, 12, 20 megapixel cameras are exactly the same. So if you're buying a 20 megapixel camera thinking that you're going to get a better measurement, the data tells you, the technical specs of these sensors tell you that this is wrong. You might say, okay, this is a tension test, which is a special case. It's a narrow sample and so on. Let's go to a wider sort of field of view where we will get the benefit of these high resolution square sensors and so on. Well, let's go to the FLC test. And this is another case where, again, high resolution total pixel count is very deceptive. An FLC test, as you can see in the schematic, is an axisymmetric test. If you look at it from the top, whether it's a single camera or 2 cameras or 3 cameras or whatever, you will see technically a circle. And to try to capture that circle with any camera sensor, the best sensor to capture the full view is a square sensor. That's basically an image on the top of the sample before and after deformation. And if you are interested in how this is processed, ultimately that's how it looks like. We process the center of it because that's what FLC is about, deformation, the center of the sample. Now, if you were to pick any sensor for this kind of a test, from this array of sensors that we presented that are available on the market, you can pick any 3 sensors, but I wanted to pick 3 sensors to demonstrate the point here, and I picked the 8, 12, and the 60 megapixel sensors. And obviously, if you take all these 3 sensors and you try to maximize what you can get from an FLC testing perspective, you will notice that the 12 and the 60 megapixel sensors will not give you much advantage over the 8 megapixel because you've already covered the square that you're interested in. You use a larger sensor like the 12 or the 16, you're just basically covering extra space that you don't necessarily need. And again, there is no difference whatsoever in terms of spatial resolution and pixel coverage from a testing perspective between any of these three cameras. In fact, the 8 megapixel is just perfect. So that's another example why we believe that this whole idea of presenting things by the sensor size, the overall sensor size, is deceptive. And people have been sometimes using sensors because they're labeled as high resolution, but in reality, they're not really high resolution whatsoever. They just give you a higher pixel count, total pixel count, but they're not necessarily reflective on material testing. So the sum up of this message is, just by looking at the overall pixel distribution of a camera sensor, it's clear that using the total pixel count could be deceiving. Separating this into a horizontal pixel count, where basically this is related to the spatial resolution, that's how you can maximize your utilization, and the aspect ratio of the sensor, this is really dependent on the application. You could be better off doing it that way. And at the end of the day, it really doesn't matter how you approach it. What matters is the end result, and that is not to overuse or use a sensor that is just seemingly giving you better resolution, but in reality is just giving you extra useless pixels. This is one of the technical aspects. Let's go to other technical aspects. Sensor throughput. If you focus on USB 3 cameras, because they're the most commonly used cameras for DIC applications, in fact for most industrial applications, you can see from this map here of these sensors, I tried to pull the maximum frame rate of all of these sensors as published on Sony's website, and you see numbers like these numbers that I'm presenting you here on the top right corner. And obviously for a lower resolution camera like the 2.3, you get higher frame rates, 160 frames per second, roughly speaking, give and take. As you go to 5, 8, 12, 16, and so on, you increase the resolution of the sensor, you lose maximum frame rate, and ultimately with a 24 megapixel camera, you're limited to around 15 frames per second. If you multiply these two numbers by each other, you get the throughput of the camera, and roughly speaking, all of them give you, again, give and take, around the same number. It hovers around 380 megabytes per second, which is technically the throughput of a USB 3 kind of a connection. You cannot break this number or barrier without changing the data transfer protocol. And that means going to other protocols, the most popular of which is the GigE cameras. There's 5, 10, 25, 50, 100, and so on. You can go faster. You can push a greater amount of data out of these sensors. And there are some other protocols, but regardless what, if you basically want to push that number, you cannot push it unless you change the protocol. So basically within the USB 3 domain, which is the most appropriate for material testing, as we will show later on, if you go higher in resolution, you're automatically limiting yourself in terms of the maximum recording rate. And so if you don't really need that, if you don't need the extra pixels, why limit yourself in the first place? Because again, as we will show later on, frame rate is very important regardless what testing you're doing. And most of the time you will find yourself thirsty for more than 10 or 15 or 20 frames per second. Let's take another technical item to try to wrap up the first part of this webcast, and that's image trimming. This is usually something used as a justification for using high resolution sensors or high megapixel count sensors. The idea is you can always trim your image, so fine, buy the 20 megapixel camera and then trim it as you see fit, and this way you can satisfy the requirement of your test, and this way you have a high resolution camera when you need it. Well, let's talk about trimming. Imagine or consider two axes here with all of these sensors, horizontal and vertical, for each of these sensors. Trimming the image, this is just a fact and a limitation by these sensors. Trimming the image around the horizontal axis will enable you to achieve higher frame rates. But nevertheless, that will not guarantee you a linear or a fixed throughput, meaning you will lose some throughput if you do this trimming. Second, if you trim the image around the vertical axis, it will bring you almost zero, negligible increase in throughput, or basically in frame rates, and it will cause a significant drop in throughput. So let me try to explain this a little bit better. Let's take the first case. I have an example sensor here, which is the 8 megapixel sensor. This is one of our favorite sensors for all of our testing. If you take this sensor as is, 8 megapixel will give you about 45 to 50 frames per second, depending on the vendor, around 390 megabytes per second throughput. If you were to trim the image vertically around the horizontal axis, just like these, as you can see my rectangles, so you go from 100% to 90% to 80 to 70 to 30 to 20, whatever. You can see my tabulated data on the top right. Your frame rate will increase as you trim more and more, from 48 to 56 to 75 to 100 to 200 to 265 and so on. And so that is where you can really truly take advantage of your trimming, and it's a practice that we truly encourage, because at least when you trim the image like that, you gain something, and that is basically an increase in the frame rate. But you must be very careful. Your throughput will drop regardless what you do. Your throughput will drop slowly at the beginning and very fast towards the end. Like as you can see here, your throughput was 390. It drops to 350, roughly speaking, when you trim half the image. But when you go to small, narrow windows, like 10%, your throughput, you lose half of it, because that's how it works. And you really cannot just linearly increase your frame rate against your image size. Let's take the other case, and that is trimming around the vertical axis. So when you trim around the vertical axis, horizontally basically, and regardless what window size you take, whether you take 90% or 80% or 10% of the image, your output frame rate will be marginally higher than the full frame rate. As you can see for this camera, you're going from 45, 48, all the way to maybe 52 to 55, depending on the camera, and that's about it. That's about 7 to 10% increase. And then after that, whatever additional trimming you do, even if you drop the image to 20%, it really wouldn't matter, and your throughput is completely trashed. That's the point that we're trying to make here. Trimming is a fantastic tool, but you gotta be careful about it. And ultimately it has its limitations, and you cannot just rely on it to fix the problem of a bad choice of a camera sensor. What does that mean? Take a tension test. I'm trying to do a tension test. If we can achieve the desired results, and that is basically good results, good DIC measurements, for properties or fracture or whatever it is, as we will show later in part 2, from a decent sensor like a 6 megapixel, why go to a 20 megapixel sensor or 24 or 32? Why? If you think that you can take this 20 megapixel sensor, for example, and it's like, okay, yeah, I can just trim it in the X and Y as you see fit, or as I need to satisfy this tension test, you will have some limitations. The throughput will drop, so you're better off to start with a more appropriate sensor in the first place to satisfy your requirements for tension testing. And trying to force larger sensors to work with everything is not necessarily correct, even if you apply all the trimming that you want. And last but not least, I would like to remind people out there that most DIC basically systems do not permit you much, sometimes any, freedom in trimming images. What does that mean? Some DIC systems will not allow you to trim images at all. So you buy the wrong sensor, or the, let's call it oversized sensor, you're just stuck with it and you're just recording large images for no reason. The ones who allow you to trim, they limit you. For example, a 12.3 megapixel sensor, very popular sensor. You can trim it from 100% to I think 65% to 35%, and that's about it. And what if I need less than this field of view? What if I want to trim in the X and Y to reduce the size of my image because I have an already very large sensor? You cannot do that. So trimming is an important topic. We encourage it, as you will see in part 2. And we always say that You just have to be careful about it, because at the end of the day, you will be limited, and you are better off to start with the right sensor in the first place. So I'm going to stop basically here, and we will continue with the second part of this webcast in a separate recording. Thank you.